to resolving the conflict. Israel's refusal to withdraw from the territories it conquered in the June 67 war and to accept its legal borders. Well, we're going to try again that simple exercise of moral principle versus hypocrisy. The state has the right to be free from threats or use of force. If you look at Hamas's statements, some of them are ambiguous, and others of them have been pretty clear. The most recent interview by Mr. Michel, the most recent interview he gave in Al Jazeera, which reiterates many statements that they've made in the last couple of years, have agreed to recognize Israel on its June 67 borders. I'll agree the use of the word recognize is ambiguous, but willing to accept the June 1967 borders. So the worst you can say about Hamas is that its record has been somewhat ambiguous, some statements clearly accepting Israel, others more ambiguous. But what's Israel's record? No Israeli government, no Israeli political party, no major Israeli political figure has ever recognized a Palestinian state on the June 1967 borders. Its record is completely unambiguous. There is no Israeli government, political party, or major political figure who has ever called for a full Israeli withdrawal from the territories it conquered during the June 1967 war. In fact, as the world demands that Hamas recognize Israel, the current Israeli government is building a wall which will annex between 10 and 13% of the West Bank, which will divide the West Bank into about 6 or more fragments, which has effectively annexed the Jordan Valley, and which will leave for the Palestinians about 50% of the West Bank. Or, as Israel's most influential newspaper, Haaretz, put it, between the eastward expansion of the Israeli settlements, the westward expansion of the Israeli settlements, and the expansion of the settlement blocks toward the Green Line, the Palestinians are left with no territory on which to establish a state. And so we're left again with that same conclusion. These aren't moral principles that are being applied to the Palestinians. These are not legal principles that are being applied to the Palestinians. These are hypocritical principles which are being applied to them. That, to me, as far as I could tell, is the documentary record on the conflict, the history, the human rights record, and the legal diplomatic record. And if it is, as I claim, and as I think the documentary record shows, if it's remarkably uncontroversial, then how do you account for all the controversies surrounding the conflict? And the main argument I would want to make is most of the controversy is artificial. It's fabricated precisely to divert people's attention from what this record shows. It's not true to say that everything in the record is, all the controversy is fabricated. There is some parts of the record which, it seems to me, they are real, and we should be honest about them. And that's most notably the question of the Palestinian refugees, which I promised I would return to. So first of all, let's look at what these legitimate controversies look like. First of all, you can agree on facts, but disagree in your moral judgment on facts. What does that mean? You take someone like Benny Morris, that Israeli historian who I said was most responsible for clarifying the record and how the Palestinians became refugees. And Morris doesn't dispute that the Palestinians were ethnically cleansed in 1948. But Morris says, I don't think that was a bad thing. Sometimes, he says, ethnic cleansings are good things. And he gives the example of our own North America. He said that and I'm quoting him, the annihilation of the native population was a good thing because it allowed for the creation of the great American Republic. And he says that the main error that the Israeli leadership committed in 1948 is that they didn't expel all the Palestinians from what became Israel, from the West Bank and Gaza. And he said, had they all been expelled, then we wouldn't have these problems today. Sort of like Germany exterminated all the Jews, and so there's no Jewish problem in Germany today. If you leave aside people like Morris, put them on the side, and then you return to the moral universe of most normal human beings, you still have perplexities because you can agree in your factual judgments, you can agree in your moral judgments, you can agree in your legal judgments, but you can still disagree in your political judgments. That's a little bit more complicated. How can that be? So let's take an illustration from the moral universe of normal human beings. Let's take the case of Professor Chomsky. He says the Palestinians were ethnically cleansed in 1948. That's what the historical record shows. He says morally, ethnic cleansings are abominations. That's a no-brainer. He says legally, the Palestinians have the right of return. Again, that's uncontroversial under international law. For those of you who doubt it, go look at the statements of Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. In the year 2000 and 2001, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, they issued official statements, and they said, under international law, there can't be any question. Palestinians have the right of return. So, Chomsky, echoing the main human rights organization, says legally they have the right of return. But he says, politically, I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think it's politically realistic. And so he says, in my opinion, those who tell Palestinian refugees in camps in Lebanon that they're going to return, when he says, you know and they know they're not, he says, I think that's very immoral, giving people false hopes about something which is not realistic. Well, to my thinking, that's a political judgment. Political judgment is just that. It's weighing 1,000 factors and then trying to decide what is and what is not politically realistic or possible. If he's right, and it's not realistic and possible, then I think his conclusion reasonably follows. It becomes immoral to give people false hope. If, on the other hand, you weigh those 1,000 factors and you think it is possible, then obviously there's nothing immoral about trying to organize on that principle. That, to me, is a legitimate difference. It doesn't make anyone an enemy. It means people have reached different judgments weighing all the factors which can never be known with any kind of scientific precision. The only qualifications I would make to that are two. Number one, whatever our judgment on the political feasibility of the right of return, there is no dispute and no debate that legally Palestinians have the right of return under international law. And the second qualification I would make is that we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that on the bigger issue, namely the question of the two-state settlement, there is no debate, no dispute, and no contention in the international community. The right of return is more, it's a problem. And I think we should be honest about that. But most of what passes for controversy in the Israel-Palestine conflict is not controversial. It's simply fake. It's false controversy. I'll just give three typical examples and then allow for the audience to join in, and we'll have a fruitful exchange. First of all, there's the claim that this conflict is so complicated that it requires the equivalent of rocket science to penetrate its mysteries. It's about a cosmic clash of religions, civilizations. It can't be compared to any other conflict. Never compare this conflict to others because it's so complicated, it's so different. The purpose of this claim is very obvious. Namely, we're told not to compare because when you make the obvious comparisons, Israel always comes out on the wrong side. So, for example, the obvious historical comparison to the Israel-Palestine conflict is what happened to the Native Americans in North America. A foreign settler population coming and displacing the indigenous population. I once sat down and made a comparison between what happened to the Palestinians and what happened to the Cherokee in North America. It worked pretty well. Obviously, it wasn't perfect, but if it were perfect, it wouldn't be an analogy. What makes an analogy means there are significant aspects of the two things you're comparing which are similar. It works pretty well.